Okay, try. Good morning, children. I am supposed to discuss the poetry syllabus today, but I won't be able to handle all the 26 poems in the syllabus. So what I have done is I have selected about 30, starting from the late Victorian period, starting with Gerald Manley Hopkins's Spring and Fall, and ending with Explosion. I have tried to categorize these poems for your convenience according to themes. So I have a plan like this, a scheme like this. So I have Spring and Fall. Remember, among school children, Design, the fisherman mourned by his wife together. They can be easily studied together because if you look at them carefully, you'll find that they deal with very profound human experiences. For example, they deal with life, the condition of life, love, creation, death and aging. Because if you take Spring and Fall, as the title suggests, it relates to the natural world as well as the human world. The poet sees the similarity or the parallel between the behavior of nature and the human condition. So the context is a young girl looking at falling leaves during autumn. Because she's very young and innocent, she weeps to see the golden grove unleaving. And the poet comments, because she's still young and she's immature, she grieves over the falling leaves. But as she becomes an adult and matures, she will take it as something natural, the life cycle. So as nature, especially in temperate countries, nature behaves according to 4 seasons. So there's the cycle of nature, which is parallel by the cycle of life. So the child will mature into an adult. The adult will mature into old age, and then death will come. So that is the reality that the poet is talking about. So it deals with a very serious life experience. Death and decay, they are cited as common experiences. At the moment, Margaret is too young to understand it, but he suggests that as she becomes an adult and then she grows into old age, she will accept this reality. So remember, also deals with the deep life experience. Once again, it's death and grief. So Christina Rossetti at first advises the lover not to grieve after she dies, after the speaker dies, the narrator dies. But in the second stanza, she in a way contradicts herself because she sees there's no point in grieving. Grieving will only bring about pain. So it's better to forget everything. So once again, love, death, and separation are profound experiences that the writer is talking about. In the third poem, among school children, once again, Yeats talks about the cycle of life. The poem is a long poem with 8 stanzas, 8 lines in each stanza, which gives it a very somber, profound tone, in fact. So he starts with a context. He visits a school as a school inspector, 60 years old. And then he's taken round the school by a nun. So he experiences young children. This takes him back to his own childhood, his experience as a child studying in school. And then he remembers his old lover, Maud Gong, who had spoken about a bad experience she had in school, where she was ill-treated. And then memories are awakened. He remembers, he compares Maud Gong to Leda in Greek mythology. And he remembers Maud now as an old woman, where her beauty has faded. He reflects on his own condition as an old man. And then he talks about the education of great men like Aristotle, Pythagoras, and other great Greek philosophers who have been highly educated, who developed philosophies, very high levels of intellectual and mathematical excellence. But they're all gone now, all dead. And he asked the question, can you separate the dance from the dancer? It's all to do with life, because a person's life experiences, whether they are good or bad, finally, that makes up the sum total of life. And the sum total of life is cyclical. You start as a child, then you become a youth, you are exposed to education, you go through school, you mature, you become an academic or an intellectual, and then you fade away. So being with children makes him philosophical, makes him reflect on life itself. So it's a very profound experience that he presents. This is the experience. However great you are, however clever you are, whatever heights you have reached, finally it will end in death. Nothing is permanent, nothing lasts forever. So it's like the dancer and the dance. They are bound up together. Then the next poem I have selected his design. There are Robert Frost. It suggested that it's his greatest poem, the sonnet of 14 lines. And design also deals with a very profound issue of life. Now, design could be positive, negative. When you talk about design, it could be a beautiful, you get a beautiful picture, something very aesthetic, something very artistic, something attractive. But design could also be negative. You know, the noun design and the verb design. You design a trap for somebody. So design could relate to the word conspiracy also. And Frost is nuancing this. When you read the poem, at the first glance, you might think it's about nature. Nature's design, if you like. Because you have the heel, the beautiful flower. You have the moth, and you have the spider. So there he is talking about nature. But what has happened in that context? The moth had, apparently the spider had attacked the moth and killed it. And for some reason or other, their colors have changed. The blue has become white. Spider has also become white. The moth looks like a piece of satin cloth, suggesting that. So he takes a minuscule piece of nature and he seems to raise the question, whose design is this? Nature has been created, of course. Nature is pretty beautiful. There's a pattern in it. But in that pattern, there's not only beauty. There's also cruelty. There's goodness as well as evil. So he seems to question, like from a Christian stance, if you look at it from a Christian perspective, all nature is attributed to God. God has created this design. But is this also part of God's design? This evil, where one creature devours the other creature, where there seems to be a conspiracy among all these, like the heel seems to have supported the moth to destroy, the spider to destroy the moth. So he seems to be questioning the very creation itself. So it's a very complex poem, with a very deep understanding of nature, of creation itself. Then when we move on to the next poem, The Fisherman Mourned by His Wife, a Sri Lankan poet, there are issues once again related to love, life, and death. Apparently, two young people have been brought together. It had been contrived, of course, and a relationship had been established. And the relationship had been a very deep one, mutually acceptable, but then there's the tragedy. The husband dies at sea, and the woman is left bereft. So once again, The poet talks about death, the burial of the husband, and then the future of the wife. However much she has loved her husband, after his death, he has to be buried. And then the poem ends on that very cryptic note. Somebody had gone to bring the hearse. So that is facing reality. The ultimate reality is death, and you have to face it, and you have to continue life. So all these poems that I have cited, starting with Spring and Fall, Remember, Among School Children, Design, The Fisherman Mourned by His Wife, they all deal with deep human issues, with the human condition, with life and death, with love and change, and the nature of life itself. Then I have selected other poems related to society, like Introduction, Phenomenal Woman, Unknown Girl. Those I have put together because you can study them together. So they deal with social issues, social aspects. In Introduction, Kamala Das talks about identity. Her identity, her individuality. She's born to a conservative Indian family, brought up in a very conservative environment. If you have read her life history, her biography, you know that she was married very young, proposed and married. But then she started writing, and then she started writing English. So it's also about language, because culture and identity are inseparable. Your identity springs from your culture. But Kamala Das talks about not a single culture. It's not a monoculture. It's a multicultural background. She's Malayalam, but educated in English. And she started writing both Malayalam and English. And she defends her choice of English as the medium of her writing. Apparently, she had run into problems with her immediate family, with her extended family, with her relations, who inquired why she's not writing in her mother tongue, why she's writing in a foreign language. And she defends her position. She says that English is not a foreign language. English is part of her. She has a symbiotic relationship with English. She had grown up with English, and it's internalized in her. So in that introduction, it's an introduction of herself, of her beliefs, of her values, and of her aspiration. It's a very powerful poem about identity. So you can also say that it's feminist in nature, because this is a woman. She had not only to contend with choice of language. In this new identity, she had also contend with male chauvinism, because her family came from a very conservative Indian background. where the male, it was dominated by the males, a male dominant society. So she had to fight gender issues. She had to fight linguistic issues, and she had also to fight personal issues. She had to find her own identity. So it's an introduction of a very complex kind. She introduces herself as a woman who sought liberation from all these linguistic, cultural, social, and even creative, because she continued to write in English as a creative writer, and she established herself. A phenomenal woman, on the other hand, she comes from an American background. She more or less reiterates similar sentiments, but of course from a different perspective. Her issue is more, it is social of course, but it's more cultural, if you like. And it's mostly gender issues that she has to fight. Not only white culture and white male dominance, but also black male dominance. And it seems to be a song of praise. It's a song of joy, where the woman has liberated herself. She has established her own lifestyle, her own values. Above all, she could brace up and face all the obstructions placed in her way. She had broken free of those obstructions. And so she is a phenomenal woman. Phenomenon is a strange event, a miraculous event. So her breaking away from the dominant black culture and the oppressive white culture to establish her own identity is emancipation. She is an emancipated woman. And it's a paean of joy. You know, she expresses herself as an emancipated woman. So if you study Kamala Das's introduction and Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman, you will see much commonality there. The cultural backgrounds are different, context may be different, but they seem to share so much in common. Then The Unknown Girl, it's again cross-cultural because it's written by an expatriate Pakistani writer, Monisa Alvi. But she reaches out, whereas Kamala Das reaches away from her background culture to the English language and maybe the culture surrounding the English language. Monisa Alvi actually reached across countries to India because hers is a very Indian cultural experience. This hennaing the palm, it's a very Indian aesthetic experience. Because in India, they use a lot of henna on the feet and the hands. So she has apparently come to India, and then she had gone through this ritual of hennaing her hand. And she gets a lot of joy out of that. She brings to the front the Indian experience. It's in a little bazaar that this happened, where she talks about the terrible commercialization. In this terribly commercialized world, there's this little spring of culture, of artistic value, because it's an unknown girl. She never comes to know the girl's name or her identity. But then she seems to be a symbol of Indian culture. So, as I said, it's a cross-cultural experience. The reaching back to her culture. Apparently, she's brought up in the West, and then for her, it becomes a very exotic experience going back to India and being touched by that culture that she has left behind. She says, like, after her hands are hennaed, like the brown lines erase away, and then you see the amber bird underneath. So it's like a journey of discovery, because she hasn't seen India at its true self, at its depth, because she talks about the men hanging on to the buses and so on. There's the darkness, there's the, if you like, the poverty. There's the disorder because of the clothes are all in disarray. But at the same time, there's this amber bird on her palm, the peacock, the great artistry, the great culture that lies underneath. So for her, it's a voyage of discovery. Then I have taken some other poems together. Suicide in the Trenches. Also, Morning at the Window, because they go together. It's contemporary, they belong together. Animal Crackers, Cathedral Builders, and Explosion. So I have put them all together. When you study, if you study them together, there'll be much more meaning. Because Suicide in the Trenches, set in the background of the First World War, is a critique of war, actually. It's very dismal, because the first stanza gives a background of happiness, carefree, a carefree life, and joy. The young boy who joins the army has no idea about what it entails. He doesn't know about life in the trenches. So he whistles and he can sleep very well. He goes with a lot of hope, as I suppose a lot of young men who join war, who join as soldiers. So, but then once he goes into the battlefield, he is put into a trench, and then life becomes a life of horror. He can't bear it anymore. The daily routine of shells falling, the mud, and the dying around him. So finally, he kills himself. The last stanza is a comment on all this, because generally, war is celebrated by the war makers, people who make war, and even the general public. For them, war is something glorious. The soldier is also celebrated, but the reality, Siegfried Sassoon, who really experienced war. He was a soldier in the First World War. He really experienced it. And he blames people who clap and shout and, who cheer soldiers coming back. He calls them smug-faced because they don't know the reality. They don't know what the boys in the battlefield undergo. So he criticizes the public. In a way, the public is responsible because they celebrate war, they cheer war, wars are created. So it's about war and violence. It's about conflict. Animal Crackers by Richard de Souza puts it, of course, in a different way. He doesn't actually bear the violence. Instead, he uses irony. So like he covers everything under the symbol of animal crackers. But again, there's a lot of social criticism in it. Because he starts off, there are apparently crackers made in the form of animals. So for young children, it's great fun. You have a cracker in the form of a lion. You have a cracker in the form of a tiger. And you light it and there's a lot of noise and then you have fun. So he's not talking about that kind of cracker. He's talking about the horrible conflict between the major communities in Sri Lanka, between the Sinhalese and the Tamil. And then he suggests the tragedy of it all, because when the lions and the tigers clash, it's actually the cats that are killed or destroyed. The cats are burnt, suggesting the innocent civilians, the simple people, the civilians, the people at the grassroots, the ordinary people who didn't have anything to do with war. They are the ones who finally suffer. They are the ones who bear the brunt of the conflict. So it's a very powerful poem, very expressive poem, because he uses symbolism very powerfully. And it's very dramatic because he starts with a simple home experience about a child drawing a tiger. The paper tiger finally expands into a live tiger. And then the tiger and the lion clashes. They clash. And the upshot of it, of course, is the killing of the cats. So it's a very ironical poem about the tense situation that prevailed in Sri Lanka, the clash between the two communities, and then the final end result of the effect on the innocent civilians. So in a way, in his irony, of course, he shares Siegfried Sassoon's experience. Siegfried, of course, is very open, very direct. He blames society for celebrating war, for cheering the soldiers, for endorsing war. Here too, Richard de Souza blames the society, blames the public for what has happened. Because this clash has taken place and finally innocent people have become the victims. Then explosion is also on the ethnic conflict of Sri Lanka. It's again set in a, Richard of course doesn't take a particular context, but here Vivimari places it in a particular context. The bombing of the central bank, where so many people, actually 91 people were killed then and there. So many others were hurt and they were maimed for life. So she reiterates the incidents of the 1994 bombing, 1996, I think, 1996 central bank bombing. That was the day that pensioners actually went to collect their pension. So most of the people who were killed were elderly pensioners. And she brings out the weight. After all, these are people who have served the nation and now they are living in retirement. And without any provocation, they have been killed horribly because a truckload of explosives was driven into the bank building. And she does not spare the horror. She talks about how the limbs are severed, eyes are blinded, people are crushed under the cement and metal. And then also, I mean, it's sort of, she becomes very stark because she says some people's eyeballs popped out of their eyes and they were in their palms. So she's very direct, pointedly direct, in order to communicate the horror of the situation. And then the poem ends up with the irony that a driver in a car is killed, but the radio is still playing. And the radio makes a communication about insurance. So that is the reality. So apart from criticizing conflict, criticizing the horror of war, she's also criticizing the economic factor that the whole of life is commercialized. And the reality is that most of these people would have been insured and the insurance company will have a field day. So they are the ones who are benefited. They are the ones who are benefited because, like the insurance payments finally will enrich them. So all these poems are on social injustice, on violence, on conflict, on social issues related to social situations, the ethnic differences, international intrigue, and international conflict. Cathedral builders, I have put together there. Of course, there's no violence as such. So it's different to the other three poems, but it's again about social injustice. John Norman talks about the injustice meted out to cathedral builders. Building a cathedral is a massive task and also a very dangerous task. And apparently he is talking about a time when new technology was not available. Now I suppose building a high structure, putting up a high building is not that risky. But when the time that John Norman talks about, it was life-threatening. So with so much risk taken, so much dedication, the cathedral was built. But on the day the cathedral was opened, only the VIPs, the church hierarchy, was invited. The builders had no place there. They didn't even get standing room. They were totally ignored. And John Norman talks about this very ironical situation where the builders had no place in the building, but others had simply taken over, and their dedication, their risk, even the fact they had grown old in building the cathedral. They had actually grown old on the job. That was totally disregarded. So there's great social injustice there. Inequality in society, the class difference. So I thought it fit to put cathedral builders along with the others, because it's a very social context. Finally, that leaves us mourning at the window. So that could have actually come here, I think, because that is aftermath of the First World War. T.S. Eliot talks about the grim scene, the hopelessness, the lack of faith, and the poverty of the period after the First World War. The loneliness and the isolation of human beings. Like, he deals with the topic in a lot of other poems as well. In this too, he talks about the alienation, the isolation, and the poverty, and the grim experience of people, situation after the war. Okay, so I have taken you through 13 poems, I think. And then if you want me to elaborate, you can ask questions. And I'm ready to answer those questions. Very often at A levels, I haven't actually, I don't have anything to do with the paper or the examination. But what I have noticed is that questions in poetry and the short story tend to go across, cut across text. So you don't get a question on a particular text, but you are given the choice of answering a question taking into account number of texts. So that's why I have grouped these poems together. And because I saw common themes, common context, and of course there'll be the difference in language when you take into account the periods in which these poems are written. Firstly, like spring and fall, remember, they are more or less contemporary. They come. Rossetti was a little earlier than Hopkins, but they belong to a similar period, and you will find that there are common, maybe common features of language. But of course, Gerald Manley Hopkins was an innovator. He was a creative writer in the true sense of the word, because he used the English language to communicate his very complex ideas. So he creates new words, neologisms, words like unleaving, wormwood, golden grove. He creates language. And then his attitude to, since he was a very religious person, you will find that his themes are very close to religious beliefs. So this idea of death and decay, of the mortality of man, for example. Mortality is death. So the mortality of man, he talks about that. Christina Rossetti belonged to a particular group of writers called the Pre-Raphaelites, where this concern, once again, the concern with death and the afterlife, a kind of late romantic movement. So you will probably find her poem rather sentimental. Then Yeats came a little bit late, of course, but Yeats also writes in a very refined, very well-crafted style of writing, because his poem is very orderly, beautifully arranged. 8 stanzas of 8 lines, and the lines rhyme as well. And then the thought runs through from the first stanza to the last stanza, starting with the present context, going back to the past, and then the final reflection. He takes us through a whole gamut of human experience. His experience, of course, personal experience, and he brings in the life experiences of others, like Maud Gonne, the woman he loved, and then Caracento, also the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Pythagoras, to suggest the final event, that all these, however greatness you reach, however powerful you have been, however creative, however intellectual, finally meets death. You become old, and then but it's not a pessimistic poem. No, it's not pessimistic. It just bears the reality. So this is life. It's like the dancer and the dance. You can't separate the experience from the person. They are tied together. It's the experience that makes a person, and finally, both experience and the person fades away. So it's a once again, deeply philosophical poem, which makes us think about life. Then, I think I have already mentioned about design, a 14-line sonnet, and it said that it's it's a classic sonnet because Frost uses the sonnet form at its highest level, at its most refined level. So, as I said, it's a poem apparently about nature, but it's about life. It's about the creation itself. It seems to question the creation, the negative side of the creation, in fact. So that's why you should study them together, because then you understand the profundity of all these experiences. Then the other poems in the next group, I have taken 3 actually are by women. Introduction, Phenomenal Woman, and Unknown Girl are by 3 women writers. And I have mentioned the commonality between Kamala Das and Maya Angelou. They both fought for identity. Maya Angelou, of course, at a very intense level, because she had to fight both white and black domination, free herself. And then, as I said, it's a pain, a pain of joy, a song of joy, where she asserts her identity and she projects to the world the liberated woman. Of course, the Unknown Girl is different. In a way, it's opposite of what the other 2 have done. Being an expatriate, she reaches out to the original culture. And she seems to, it's a voyage of discovery, going back to the land of her ancestors and discovering its richness, its rich art and its rich culture. So, and then the final few poems, they are all about violence and conflict. So I have taken you through 13 poems, in fact. So if you have any questions to ask, I'm willing to answer. Maybe I can elaborate on them more. What's the time? No, it's okay. We can go into the questions then.
These are the questions. So this is the first time.
It's difficult to read it.
What type of poems can come theme of issues of children and youth?
Issues of children and youth. What kind of poems? Children and youth. I suppose spring and fall can come under issues of children, because there's this young child actually looking out, and then sees the leaves falling, because in autumn, in the European background, in the temperate climate, leaves color and then they fall. So she's very hurt about it, very upset about it. You know, it shows the child's sensitivity, you know, to the world around her. She can't bear it, because at first the leaves are so beautiful. That's why it's called Golden Grove. So the Golden Grove is unleaving. Unleaving is a very powerful word that Hopkins uses there. Without using the word leaves fall, he says unleaving. Leaves are coming out of the tree. So it seems to be a very simple experience, leaves falling from the trees, but still, for the little child, it's a crisis, it's a problem. And she starts crying. Then the voice of the writer, that is the adult, tells her, Margaret, you are too young to understand this. But as you grow older, you will see the world differently, and then probably you will not cry. You will realize that this is the reality of life. So she will even understand something more than that. That it's not only the leaves that fall, it's also human life. That human life, like the leaves falling from the tree, human beings also become old, they age, and then they die. So mortality, death is something very difficult for young children to understand. But eventually, they will understand it as they grow older. So, not specifically for children, of course, it's not a children's poem. You will say that it's actually for adults because the child only provides the context. But through that context, he communicates a very powerful reality, a powerful truth about life. So you can say that at least the character in the poem is a young child, and it's about a child's vision of life, but it communicates something much more complex. It's an adult communication, in fact. Then, in Animal Crackers 2, again, it's not written for children. It's for adult Sri Lankan society that Richard de Souza wrote it. But there is a child, the character of the child. The boy who draws he wants to draw. He's asked to draw a tiger. Then we know what happens. The tiger enlarges into a real tiger. And then not only the tiger, there are other animals who come on the scene. There are the lions, there are the jackals, there are the cats. So, and then that creates a grim picture about Sri Lankan society. So, poems prescribed for A-level students will not probably be children's poems, because when a child reaches A-level, we expect a certain amount of not only maturity in age, but also intellectual maturity, maturity in language, and also maturity in insight, understanding. So these poems are not, they center around children, but then they are not children's poems. They address very serious adult issues, in fact. Life issues, as in Spring and Fall, social issues, as in Animal Crackers. Okay.
Literary period does John Ormond belong?
To what literary period? All right. John Ormond is actually a modern poet. Just give me a minute. I will give the details. If you haven't still got the resource book, I can give it to you. Give me a little, just a minute. Okay, I will just give you the information in case you are interested. John Norman Thomas was born on 3rd April 1923 in Britain at Dunwent near Swansea, that is near London. He studied philosophy and English at Swansea University, and at the same time studied painting at the Swansea School of Art. So that is 1923. He is a modern poet, you know, the contemporary of Philip Larkin and so on.
Next question.
Yes. Yes, please. Yes.
Can you please explain about the eras of literature?
Sorry?
Eras of
Eras of literature. Well, that is not very relevant to A-levels, but still good to have background. And also, if I were your teacher, I would have taken you through the eras. Right? In my, like, you know, my introductory lesson, or during the course of my teaching, I would have made you aware of the eras of English literature. Because it's like, if your teacher hasn't done that, she has not laid the foundation for your study. So, first, of course, we start somewhere around the 13th century, because English was not really a very current language in England at that time. They had other languages like Norse. Then they had Latin was the language of education, in fact. But by the 13th century, English had developed as the language of the country. And so you have Geoffrey Chaucer. So the first period is named after Chaucer. It's called the period of Chaucer. That is like the 13th century. Then the next period, because Chaucer was the greatest writer of that period, but there were others, but not so many, because English literature hadn't developed that much, because the language was just forming. Then the next period is called the period of Shakespeare. It's Elizabethan period. That is the 15th century. 15th century, it's called the period of Shakespeare, or the Elizabethan period, because Shakespeare was the greatest writer of that period, but it was the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And that was the golden period of English literature in England, because there were so many poets, that a lot of poets that you study. The sonneteers, you know, the sonnet came into being in England at that time. And of course, it was the period of drama. There are a lot of dramatists like Ben Jonson, Greene, and so many others. Shakespeare stood out among them. So it's also called the period of Shakespeare, but it's also named the Elizabethan period. Then we have the third period, and that is the Jacobean period, but it's also taken as part of the Elizabethan period. John Donne wrote during that period. Then we have the neoclassical period. That is people like Alexander Pope, John Dryden, John Milton, you know, Samuel Johnson, the period of epics writing, you know, the writing of the epics took place during that period. That is more or less the 17th century. So 17th century, then after that, the 18th century, that is the era of romantic poetry, romantic literature. So the romantic period, it's called the romantic period. And there are a lot of writers, a lot of poets like Wordsworth, Keats, Coleridge, Blake, Cooper, so many writers. Poetry dominated during this period, that is the 18th century roughly. So the 18th century, the tradition continued into the next century, the 19th century. So the 19th century is called the Victorian era. So you have the age of Chaucer, Elizabethan period, or the age of Shakespeare. Then you have the neoclassical period. You have the Romantic period. Then you have the Victorian period. So Victorian period is roughly the 19th century. Some of the poems written in the 18th century developed into the 19th century, but 19th century, it was a period of prose where all the great novels were written, like Dickens, Hardy, Eliot, Austen, and so many others, Sterne, and so many other writers, like those who have, I don't think we have them in Sri Lankan anthologies anymore. Charles Kingsley, so many, dozens of writers wrote novels during this period. Then we have the modern period. And of course, that's the 20th century, the modern period. And of course, now we have the postmodern period and so on. So today is the postmodern period. You also call it the post-colonial period or whatever. So those are the eras of literature.
Question.
Yes.
What does the poem Cathedral Builder say about the hierarchy people?
Hierarchy, that is actually the church hierarchy mostly. When you say hierarchy, it's really the church hierarchy. You know, like the bishops, you have the, above the bishops, you have the cardinals. You have the cardinals, you have the bishops, then you have you have other priests of different levels and so on. All right. So let's look at the poem for a little while and then you get the total picture. So as I said, this is not a modern event because, you know, John Norman was born in 1923. So he had started writing probably 10, 20 years later. So you had to place it in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we didn't have the kind of technology you have now. Now I think putting up structures is easy because you have all the technology, right? You have the, I think even this scaffolding and so on, I think they could be done very easily nowadays. And they're very safe, I think. You know, the laborers are generally safe. But during that time, they would have had to use very primitive kind of technology to build huge, these very high cathedrals. Because, you know, the shape of a cathedral, it's broad at the back and it's very steep and narrow at the top. So the cathedral was built and then, you know, like, let me get the point. Here it is. Okay, right. Let's look at the point. They climb on sketchy ladders. That gives you the picture, you know, like no new technology. Sketchy ladders, like people using bamboo poles in Sri Lanka. Sketchy ladders towards God. With winch and pulley hoisted, hewn rock into heaven. With winch and pulley, like, you know, how the stones were taken up. Very primitive methods of building. Inhabited the sky with hammers. Defied gravity. Defied stone. Took up God's house to meet him and came down to their suppers and small beer. Every night slept lay with their smelly wives, quarreled and cuffed the children, lied, spat, sang, were happy or unhappy, and every day took to the ladders again, impeded the rites of pay of another summer's fellows, grew grayer, shakier. It took a long time for them to build a cathedral because they were using very primitive methods, and they were poor people, very poor men, because he talks about the smelly wives, because their houses would have been very unhealthy, very small, cooped up little houses in which they lived with their children and their wives. So very poor people, poor men, masons and others, like who built the cathedral. It went on like that. And they became grayer and shakier. It took years and years for them to build the cathedral. Then the next part, if you come to the last few lines, it shows how the hierarchy treated them. Right, okay. Then, time to give up, to leave the spire to others. Stood in the crowd well back from the vestment at the consecration. So, consecration means, like our temples, once a temple is built, you have a ceremony. You have this Netra Puja and so on. So, a lot of people come. And for that, it's the top of society that is invited. So, finally, the stood in the crowd, well back from the vestment at the consecration. So they were not given a central place, they were not given recognition. Envy the fat bishop is warm boots, Coctus quint eye aloft. So the fat bishop suggests a very rich life. So the bishop belongs to the hierarchy of the church, well fed, maybe with good meat and wine and all that sort of thing. So the bishop was fat. Whereas these people, they didn't have a proper meal even. And their houses were like foul, like huts made for fowls, very, very poor. Children were, they lived with their children and wives. For very poor people, they were badly paid. And at the consecration, they were not recognized. They were not mentioned. Nobody cared for them. Coctus squint eye aloft. And said, I bloody did that. So of course there was the self-satisfaction. There was the self-satisfaction of the builders that they built the cathedral, but there was no recognition given to them. Recognition not in terms of money or even in terms of words, no social recognition, no gratitude from the crowd, no monetary benefits, nothing. So they were actually neglected. The hierarchy neglected them. The hierarchy took their effort for granted. There was no monetary rewards, no gratitude or thankfulness that a great cathedral had been built. So, there's great social injustice there, because the builders should have been rewarded. They should have been recognized. They should have been invited for the consecration. They should have been mentioned in that first sermon. They should have been, given thanks, but nothing was done like that. They took the building for granted. The cathedral builders were not recognized in any way. And then they were outside in the crowd. They were not among the VIPs who were invited for the consecration of the cathedral. But ironically, the men were happy because they had the self-satisfaction that they had built a beautiful structure.
I think there are more, about 5 more questions.
Right, that's
We will have to
fine.
go
That's
through.
right. Okay.
The next one in the poem Morning at the Window.
Yes.
Is there a special emphasis on the conditions of labor class women?
Labor
Class women.
Labor class women. Okay. Okay. Best thing is to go to the poem once again. Yeah. Okay. You can see that for yourself. Yes, it's actually about women, the working class, It's a working class really that he's talking about. Rattling breakfast plates in basement kitchen and along the trampled edges of the street. I'm aware of the damp souls of housemaids. Yeah, definitely. Like it's sort of, there's emphasis on housemaids, women who work for others, housemaids, sprouting despondently at area gates, sprouting those, it probably refers to, because this is soon after the war, and then probably they didn't have immediate access. I suppose they had to come to a certain place and then they had to get permission to enter that area, maybe for security reasons and various things. So suddenly they appeared. The word sprouting like, this, like plants sprout, no? All of a sudden they come out of the ground. So the word sprout is very important there. So they came. Nobody knew from where. Suddenly they appeared at the area gate. And then they had to wait a long time to get into the place where they were working. So standing, this is probably winter. And in winter, and they were not properly clothed or properly shoed also, because they were very poor. Probably they were not well shod. And then they didn't have warm clothes also. So they were, they had to stand a long time at area gate. The brown waves up to me, yeah, from the bottom of the street, twisted faces from the bottom of the street. So that might also refer to those women. And they are from a passerby with muddy shirts, an aimless smile that hovers in the air and vanishes along the level of the roofs. So it's a very, as I said, very grim poem. You get a very pessimistic picture about the aftermath of the war. So definitely here, the working class women are mentioned. And these, because he used the word sprout, you have to interpret the word sprout. They don't seem to have a proper place to stay. They don't have an identity, but they are fighting for survival. In order to live, they have to work. And they suddenly appear in these places. Nobody knew from where. Nobody knew who they were, but they were, non-entities, in fact, trying to find work, trying to live. So definitely, it's about working class women, mostly.
When writing answers, especially using trick forms, how should you find the description of a single form of choosing? Writing answers, especially using tree poem, how should you find the description of a single poem of choosing?
That, of course, is a very personal choice. Depends on how you manage the time. So, because like in the A-level paper, roughly, you have to answer 3 context questions. You have a context from drama, you have a context from the novel, you have a context from either poetry or prose. So I don't know whether you have to answer both, I think. Poetry and prose, I think. So 4 questions there, context 4 questions. And then essay type answers. You have one from drama, you have one from poetry, you have one from the short story, one from the poem. So altogether you have to answer 8 questions. So you have to learn to time the questions if you have taken too much time on drama and the novel, then you will have very little time for the short story and the poetry. So it depends. Like, I mean, if I am to frame a question using 3 poems, for example, modern poets see modern poets see violence and conflict as a common feature of society. Modern poets see violence and conflict as a common feature of society. That is the question. So, comment on this statement using 3 poems from the syllabus. So then, if I was answering, then the poems, I had to select the poems carefully because now it has to address the question. So then, one would be Suicide in the Trenches, Siegfried Sassoon, Animal Crackers, Richard de Souza, then Explosion, Vivi Marie van der Putten. So those are the 3 poems that I will select. Then I will have to discuss all 3 questions, but then I'll have to compare and contrast, I suppose. So I would, Suicide in the Trenches, I would say Suicide in the Trenches is directly about the context of war, where the actual description of the battlefield is not undertaken by the poet, but he conveys the oppression that the soldier, the psychological oppression that the soldier went through. So the contrast between the first stanza and the second stanza. In the first stanza, you see a very blithe kind of young boy, very happy with life, contented, singing and joyful. And then in the second stanza, you see the contrast, the life in the trenches, the terrible, the ordeal of danger, of daily risk of losing his life, the suffering and the misery, and then he kills himself. So there is, in this poem, Siegfried Sassoon highlights the violence of war. Then in Animal Crackers, you get another picture, of course. It's not really war, but the background social situation of war is communicated through the use of symbols, animal symbols related to the larger communities of Sri Lanka. So the underlying clashes, and then the final result of civilians caught up in this conflict. And then also the final one, the explosion, the reality of the ethnic conflict, where Vivi Marie talks about the central bank bombing. I mean, like the grim details she gives, she doesn't spare anything. The grim details of how time was stopped, even time seemed to stop. And then how the various groups were affected, how the pensioners were killed, the poor, frail, under the debris, the falling of the walls and so on, and then how some were blinded, and the final scene of the man, of the driver, killed in the car, and then the ironical, the stark irony or the sarcasm of the last line, where the insurance agent is still selling his insurance. So I would probably give more prominence to Siegfried Sassoon's Death in the Trenches, and of course, suicide in the trenches, and to explosion. Although I have taken 3 poems, I may not give weight to all 3 to spare time. I will highlight Siegfried Sassoon's poem, Suicide in the Trenches, and Explosion. But I will also mention about Animal Crackers, where, it's a different style that Richard de Souza uses, but nevertheless, the use of symbolism, the dramatic experience, it starts with the young boy, and then the imagery that he uses of a cat being burned, and then the whole social issue in Sri Lanka of the ethnic conflict. So that is how I will answer the question. So you have to have a neat balance among the 3 poems. Okay.
What are the poems written by non-Western youth?
Okay.
What are the poems written by non-Western youth?
Oh, that is a very, very basic. That is alphabet, no? Haven't they been taught that? Well, all these modern, I think I mentioned, by the names you can actually understand. So, non-Western writers would be Kamala Das, because she's an Indian. Moniz Alvi would be non-Western, but still she's living in Britain. She's a British citizen, so there's an ambiguity actually there, like you can't say that she's not non-Western because she's a British citizen. Maya Angelou is Western because she's an African American, right? So then of course we have Patrick Fernando. So non-Western would really be Patrick Fernando, Kamala Das, I think that's all. All the others are Western writers. Because even, Vivi Mary van der Putten, 3 writers, these are non-Western writers. Vivi Mary van der Putten, although she has a Berger name, she's actually a Sinhalese writer. Then Kamala Das and Patrick Fernando. Those are the 3 non-Western writers. Others, now Maya Angelou is African American, so that is Western. No? Then also Moniz Alvi, she's a British citizen, so she's a Western writer. Okay.
Please explain moral decadence.
Moral decadence. Okay. Moral decadence will be the decay of moral values, in fact. Decay of moral values, like moral values are good human qualities, like now to be faithful to your friends, that would be a moral value. To respect your parents and be grateful to your parents, that is a moral value. To be honest is a moral value, where you don't cheat others, where you don't, where you don't lie and cheat, that is a moral value. Then also where you respect lives, respect other lives, whether human or animal, that is a moral value. These are all moral values. Maybe even drinking, I suppose in some cultures, drinking is accepted in some cultures, so they won't call you immoral, like in Italy, for example, or even France or Spain, those countries. Wine is accepted as a beverage, So after a meal, it's usual to take wine, because our cultural values are different. So we won't approve of people taking wine or beer or whatever it is. In some countries, they are accepted that they are not immoral. So moral values change from culture to culture. from society to society. I don't want to criticize, but in some cultures, killing animals is not immoral. It is accepted. In Buddhist culture, killing is immoral. It's the first offense, actually. So, moral decay means the moral decadence means the decay of those values. And I think I haven't mentioned Philip Larkin's poem Money. There he talks about the decadence of moral values. People are running after money so much. Their money talks now. I mean, I will just cite that poem to you, and then I'll show you where he talks about moral decadence. Because he says, quarterly, he said, money reproaches me. Why do you let me lie here wastefully? I am all you never had of goods and sex. You could get them still by writing a few checks. So like quarter, those are pieces of money, like you have coins as well as notes. No? So here he's talking about coins. Apparently this man, a poor man, he is collecting money. But the money, here money talks. So money reproaches me. See, why do you let me lie here wastefully? Because apparently money is there to be spent, right? So I am all you never had of goods and sex. So if you use me wisely, you can have all the things you want to buy, even sex. So that is irony there, You can buy women also, not only things, but also women you can buy. You could get them still by writing a few checks. So there is moral decadence there. The way people use money now, I mean, they use money to do bad things, to buy drinks, to buy liquor, to buy drugs, to buy women. All that is moral decadence. In money, money is the best example where a poet talks about moral decadence. So then it goes on to talk about, I look at others, what they do with theirs. They certainly don't keep it upstairs. By now they have a second house and a car and wife. So see how he criticizes values? I mean, after all, what do you want in life? In life, you need a house to live in. You need a car to travel comfortably so that you can get to any place you like, right? So, and a wife. One wife is enough, right? But when you have too much money, what do? You go for a second house, you go for a second car, and not only that, you go for a second wife also. So that is, money corrupts. Money corrupts. Money brings about moral decadence. That's what Philip Larkin says. Then money has something to do with life. It's of course put in a very ironical way. Then, in fact, they have a lot in common if you inquire. You can't put off being young until you retire. And however you bank your screw, the money you save won't in the end buy you more than a shave. So this is as I said, this is the beginning. This is I suppose, a modest middle class man. He can't save much. So he saves coins. There are people who collect the 5 rupees and the 10 rupees, they put into tills and keep. So he's a person like that. So he faces the final reality that, like however much you save, finally you won't be able to buy more than a shave with that money you collect. I listen to money singing. It's like looking down from long French windows at a provincial town. The slums, the canal, churches, ornate and mad. In the evening sun, it's intensely sad. So that is why, so if you don't have money, then you are nobody. Nobody cares for you. and you can't buy anything you can't buy everything you want. So just collecting the pennies, collecting the 5 rupees and the 10 rupees, however much you collect, it won't give you the things that you want in life. So he's criticizing the moneyed society, suggests that all moral values are gone because people are running after money. Right? So there's moral decadence there. And so that is the best poem, which shows this moral decadence of modern society. But you might get it in some other forms, in some others. Also, I think Morning at the Window, there is moral decadence because after the war, I think this is what has happened to our society also. Sri Lankan society, we were different now. Before the 30-year-old war, we cared for other people. Like now, if you get a man to work for you, he will not work the 8 days. I have this personally, he'll come at 9 and he will take about 2 hours for lunch and he will vanish by 2. There's no ethic in work. They're out to get the money, but they're out to cheat. There's no conscience in them. They don't know. We as teachers, we did it. I mean, like we went to school, we taught the full, whatever, like, starting from 30 to 1:30, we taught. That work ethic is no longer there. So, you might work ethic and then also cheating, lying, even lack of respect for life. The way that people are killed, no concern at all. So all that. So Morning at the Window is soon after the First World War. And T.S. Eliot talks about the moral, he talks about the economic depression as well. But he also talks about the moral decadence. Because these housemaids, nobody is bothered about the housemaids. They just come from somewhere. They stand at those gates. Then they work in those kitchens, dark kitchens, the whole day, washing plates and things like that. They have no recognition, no identity. So that is a morally decadent society. A society which doesn't care for human beings, which does not respect human, that is a morally decadent society. Because Philip Larkin talks about the effect of money on society. What has happened to people as a result of money? Okay, next question.
What lesson can the oppressors learn from animal pressures?
Oppressors? Who are the oppressors? I think it's a little vague, I think he should make it clearer. Because the oppressors could be, there's some prejudice about the war also. Because general picture given was that the Tamils are oppressed. Nobody talks about the oppression on the single people. When bombs are kept in railways, when bombs are put into buses, when the central bank was bombed, when they bombed the bus stations, when they bombed the airports. I mean, that is also oppression. No? So the oppressors, oppressed actually, it should not be oppressors. Is it oppressors or oppressed?
Oppressors.
Can you read that again?
What lesson can the oppressors learn from animal practice?
Okay, the oppressors on both sides, I think. The LTT as well as the Sri Lankan government. Right? So maybe the lesson is in the last line where they said they are burning a silly cat. Final, the sufferers, the victims are the ordinary people, the civilians. Those who of course, and the soldiers, and the boy soldiers of the LTT, both sides. Those who fought for the LTT, I mean, they are Tamils, but still they are Sri Lankan citizens. They are young men and women, right? So they paid the price, but then the leaders on both sides, they got away with it too, right? So that war never rewards. Maybe the lesson that the oppressors or whoever, I think he has to explain the word oppressor. I would say the oppressors came from both sides, right? There was defense and offense and defense. So they came from the Tamil hierarchy, they came from the Sinhala hierarchy, both, right? And then the oppressed were wanting the civilians on both sides, both in Jaffna and the northeast as well as the Sinhala areas. And then the oppressors, probably the leaders of both groups, who went on making war. Oppressed probably are the soldiers as well as the civilians. So the lesson they have to learn is that nobody actually wins a war. Nobody really wins a war. You might say that we were victorious, but then nobody really wins a war, both sides, because it leaves a lot of damage, leaves a lot of suffering and damage and economic disruption and social upheaval. So that is one thing they have to learn. And also, I think, respect for life, I think. They have to learn to respect life, both sides, both groups. One life is not better than the other, no? You can't say that the Tamil lives are better than the Sinhala lives, or the Sinhala lives are better than the Tamil lives. So that has to be discussed. I think it's a badly worded question, because the word oppressor has to be clearly defined, I think. Who are they? All right, okay. I don't know if they have anything more, I can, but right, okay. Right, okay. Okay, right.
So, we will see you on the next session. So we will keep you on update about the dates and time and everything. So,
Okay.
thank you all.
Thank you very much then. Thank you. I think, I'm sorry, certain fundamental things are not happening, I think, in this.